All right, I just wanted to make a video going over this federalism argument essay. The argument essay is sometimes one of the most difficult parts of the AP exam, so I want to make sure that you understand how to answer this FRQ. So I'm going to go over the federalism argument essay with you and give you an example of how this question could be answered. Now, my response is not formatted in any certain way, so I don't want you to worry about that. But just an example of how you could answer each part of the prompt. I like to think of these FRQs as formulas, and you're just plugging in to the formula. So you look at the prompt, you consider the rubric. How do I answer this question? What are the scorers looking for? Okay, so that's what I really want to drive home, is answering each part of the prompt and really remembering that rubric as you answer these questions. So let's go over this question. The federal government can share revenue with state governments through grants. Some grants, such as categorical grants, place constraints on how the states are allowed to spend the money. Other types of grants, such as block grants, allow the states greater authority to determine how the money is spent. So the first part here, develop an argument that takes a position on which type of grant best serves the interests of citizens. So let's click over to my example here. So the thesis, this would be the first part of your response. Block grants better fit the needs of citizens because grant money from the federal government does not have strict conditions on how the state governments spend their money, okay? One thing to note is there's that because in there, so that's establishing that line of reasoning. Instead, states are allowed discretion to spend the money in ways that best serve their citizens. This is best evidenced by the 10th Amendment and Brutus number 1. So not only am I laying out my thesis here, so what I'm going to argue, I'm establishing that line of reasoning, why I think that block grants are better, okay, making sure I get that why in there. That's what's meant by reasoning, getting to the why. And then I'm also establishing a line of reasoning with my evidence as well by introducing my evidence. Okay, let's go back to the prompt. Use at least one piece of evidence from one of the following foundational documents, Brutus 1, Federalist 51, the 10th Amendment, and it says, in your essay, you must respond to the prompt with a defensible claim or thesis that establishes a line of reasoning, so we've got that part. Support your claim with at least one piece of specific and relevant evidence from one of the foundational documents listed above. So one of these three pieces of evidence have to be used. A second piece of evidence can come from any other foundational document not used as your first piece of evidence, or it may be from your knowledge of course concepts. So let's go back to my example here. So my first piece of evidence, remember, it had to be one of those foundational documents. So my first piece of evidence is coming from the 10th Amendment. And it says the 10th Amendment delegates all power not given to the federal government to the states, which means that states should be the ultimate authority in any powers not specifically granted to the federal government in the Constitution. So that is an explanation of what the 10th Amendment says. Here is where we include that reasoning to support the thesis. Block grants provide state governments the authority to use federal funds in a way that best serves citizens, okay? So the 10th Amendment is all about giving states federal authority, or giving states the ultimate authority. Block grants are giving states that authority, okay? So that is how I am using my evidence to support my thesis. Now, my next piece of evidence, I went ahead and chose another one of those foundational documents, just went with one of those. And it says block grants allow the states more control over how the money is spent in their state. As Brutus number 1 argues, it is necessary to prevent encroachment from the federal government. By giving states more flexibility in how they spend the money, the federal government is allowing states to determine and even experiment with what is best for their citizens. So it's laying out the argument of Brutus 1, so what is said in that document, and then it's using that reasoning to support the thesis again. So why are block grants preferable? Okay, so making sure that when you provide evidence, you're not just explaining what that evidence says, but you are relating that evidence back to your thesis, okay, making sure it supports your argument. Now, the last part is respond to an imposing or alternate perspective using refutation, concession, or rebuttal. So here I say, while it may be argued that categorical grants best serve the needs of citizens because incentives from the federal government can prompt state leaders to take action on certain policies, block grants are preferable because they give state leaders the authority in where to direct federal funds, and funding can be used where it is most needed. All right, so here is the rebuttal, okay? So it can be argued that categorical grants are better because states are getting incentives from the federal government and leaders will take action, maybe in places that they wouldn't have otherwise. However, going back to my argument, block grants are still preferable because they give state leaders that authority and where to direct federal funds, and they can put the funds where it's most needed. All right, so that's an example of a rebuttal. So this example here answers each part of that prompt, okay? So this is what you need to do when you're writing these argument essays. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be in this format. This is not good. This is just my example of how you could answer it. But each part of that question is answered, okay? And this is what scores are going to be looking for. Does it have an argument? Does it establish that line of reasoning? Are there two pieces of evidence, one of which coming from that foundational document? Is reasoning used to support the thesis? Is there a rebuttal? This is what scores are going to be looking for. So I want you to keep this in mind as you practice with these argument essays.